We are living in the slow motion transformation of the institution of Western society. Not a single coup, not an explosive revolution, but rather the reshaping of culture, law, and information, and the rise of bureaucratic power in the process. This is not just some mere conspiracy theory or paranoid conjecture. It's a hypothesis that becomes testable and apodictic, especially when we combine the empirical evidence of intellectual text, observable facts, and concrete policy outcomes. Today, we're going to explore openly and rigorously the doctrines, the mechanisms, the signs, and the evidentiary limits of a thesis that many have maybe felt, but never fully explained or explored. The idea simply is this: that Western institutional life has been and continues to be methodically repurposed so that it can no longer defend a classical liberal social order. That is, the removal of the rights of the individual, the smallest minority group of all. The reasons are obvious. Western European Judeo-Christian culture was built upon the premise of natural law, that man, and not just mankind, but every individual human being, is sovereign and independent, governed by objectivity, fairness, and equality, under the eyes of a sovereign and righteous God, and free to choose their own destiny. This, of course, is in direct conflict with communism and collectivism. At their root, these ideologies believe that man is greedy and needs to be put under the thumb of the rules and whims of other men for the greater good of civilization. This, of course, is logically impossible to have greedy men run by other men who are greedy and in control of the institutions that so control the other people. This struggle, the power struggle between the state and the individual, is the great struggle of our entire human history. The struggle over our political soul and independence. For general consideration, we need to reflect on a quote by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who provides the a priori truth that goes beyond the empirical evidence. A communist system can be recognized that it spares the criminals and criminalizes the political opponents. Modern-day history, especially in the Canadian context, seems to be full of this truth. There seem to be hundreds of examples in the Canadian judiciary system where criminals are being let go under lax bail rules, and violent criminals are being let go because they're claiming refugee status. Today, we are going to review what would be required as evidence to show this centralized coordination. And we're going to look at specific examples in the Canadian context that demonstrate not only the evidence, but proving the mechanisms as well. In creating this video, I'm not rage farming. I'm not promoting conspiracy theories. I'm not fomenting hatred or making these comments glibly. I'm merely going to present the evidence to you so you can make your own informed decision about this. So if you're ready, let's dive in. Let's consider the following thesis. We're going to take three intellectual undercurrents: Gramsci's War of Position, the Frankfurt School's cultural critique, and a tactical canon that's exemplified by Cloward Piven and Saul Alinsky. When combined with the rise of modern administrative law and bureaucratic-heavy platform governance, it produces a predictable dynamic. That is, culture capture, regulatory expansion, selective public order enforcement, and throttling of information. In short, groupthink at the highest levels. That predictable dynamic, in turn, may help explain why enforcement of laws and social sanction looks and feels asymmetric, and why some people are concluding that traditional institutions are being dismantled from within, and it's not by accident. So let's consider two things in contrast before we move on. Number one, these mechanisms are real and documented. And number two, a single-pointed global conspiracy cannot be proven by these mechanisms alone. Now, before we start tracing back these doctrines and mechanisms, let's pause on a principle as old as philosophy itself. Socrates warned that plain speech provoked hostility, and that hatred is sometimes the shadow cast by uncomfortable truths. Now, this is not a license to indulge in any suspicion or conspiracy. Far from it. In fact, it's an admonition. We need to be willing to follow the evidence, no matter where the evidence leads. And sometimes that's going to unsettle fashionable opinion, religious dogma, or leads us into unfamiliar territory. So let's begin with part 1, which is identifying the intellectual genealogy. Let's consider the following phrase. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men. Weak men create bad times. Bad times create strong men. This is sometimes referred to as the saeculum, an 80 to 90 year rhythm of rise, complacency, crisis, and renewal. Dalio explains this in his book The Rise and Fall of Empires. It's not a law of history, but it's handy shorthand to identify generational turnover and institutional drift. The point is simple. When cultural discipline relaxes, so too do incentives and leadership, which also relaxes. This erosion of quality sets up the next inflection. The 3 groups of thinkers we're going to study, from Antonio Gramsci, the Frankfurt School, and the writings of Cloward Piven and Saul, offer methods to sharply influence the way the cycle bends next. Now, to be clear, they don't guarantee collapse or renewal. They describe how to increase leverage over culture, administration, and morale. Now, we should also consider that all 3 of these intellectual groups are bound by the Marxist cognitive bias. Therefore, we need to consider their confirmation bias as we go through their writings. So why does this confirmation bias matter? Because each of them call for a disruption in the systems of power that create a power vacuum, with the singular and specific goal of creating an apparatus, a state apparatus, that is more collective in power in the centralized point, i.e. communism. So let's look at Antonio Gramsci. He wrote and talked extensively about cultural hegemony and the war of position. Gramsci's central premise is that the state cannot seize power by force, but rather should do so by cultural consent. He knew that Western European Judeo-Christian people would not accept new masters willingly. They would have to be won over time, decades, generations, and this is called gradualism. It is the path of democratic socialism, in direct contrast to violent revolution. In communist violent revolution, the bourgeoisie was overthrown by gunpoint. This was the case in Russia, this was the case in China. And both those countries had a long history of already being oppressed by the prior rulers, so they just swapped one out for the other. He observed that in order to change culture, the battle had to be fought in the institutions, churches, schools, unions, bureaucracies. The remedy, in his view, was a war of attrition. Outlast your enemy. It's easy to start this war through using the oppressed. And we have seen evidence of this over time with racial minorities, cultural minorities, and people with less financial means. Gramsci believed that cultivating intellectuals in civic society would help throw out the old thinking. Again, this is not conspiracy, this is documented strategy. Now let's move on to the Frankfurt School, which was a critique of the cultural diagnosis. The Frankfurt School expanded Marxist critique into the domain of culture. They used mass media, popular entertainment, and modern institutions to produce consent and conformity. Their method is diagnostic and critical. Their influence is intellectual. The Frankfurt School provides analytical tools to make cultural transformation legible and therefore actionable. Next, we're going to look at Cloward and Piven, who used overload as a political lever. In 1966, Richard Cloward and Francis Fox Piven produced a provocative operational thesis. If eligible citizens claim benefits en masse, they will overload the local and regional bureaucracies, which will eventually precipitate a federal level fix. This in itself is a centralization of the apparatus of power. Their article described the tactics as a way of forcing policy change and exploiting the gap between law and administrative practice. Whether you call that audacious or reckless, the idea is mechanistic. Push the local systems to the breaking point, which forces a centralized policy response. Now let's look at Saul Alinsky, who provided an organizer's playbook. Alinsky's Rules for Radicals is a manual for agitation. He focuses on teaching tactics, apply pressure, create ridicule and make institutions live up to their rules by exposing any contradictions. Just like the thinkers we've already analyzed, Alinsky doesn't provide a master plan. He provides actionable steps, but these steps have been picked up by organized networks, and they become replicated in practice. So let's take a look at a contrasting view, and that is of Manning Johnson and his book, Color, Communism, and Common Sense. Now, Johnson argued in that work that communist strategy used identity politics and racial grievance as instruments to break social cohesion and facilitate institutional takeover. Now, author G. Edward Griffin took up this banner of Manning Johnson's book and popularized these ideas for anti-communist audiences in the 1960s. Now, whether you accept Johnson and Griffin as historians or not, their narrative matter-of-factly describes a tactic. Use identity fissures, such as racial struggles, as strategic pressure points to undermine the bourgeoisie. So part 2, let's look at these mechanisms as it moves into practice. The doctrines of Gramsci, the Frankfurt School, Saul, Alinsky, and Cloward Piven doesn't magically change into policy. They are intellectual resources and tactical playbooks. This conversion into policy can only happen with 3 mechanisms. Number 1 is infiltration and staffing. Number 2 is administrative expansion. And number 3 is narrative and enforcement asymmetry. So let's start with number 1, infiltration and staffing. This goes right back to Antonio Gramsci. Place the right people into universities, accreditation bodies, professional associations, foundations, unions, and NGOs. And over time, the curricula, the accreditation standards, grant direction, and professional norms shift, drawn inexorably to a planned outcome. The empirical sign is in personnel change, curriculum reform, and grant streams that reward specified behavior. The battleground for this is in universities and NGOs. Some of the examples of this is aggressive DEI offices, tenure controversies in humanities departments, professional medical colleges being taken over by the state and their actors. Number 2 is administrative expansion. The Cloward Piven strategy demonstrates just how far to push a system to the breaking point. And when it does break, we can justify centralization of power. Administratively, what that looks like is new statutory frameworks and increasing the discretion and power of regulatory agencies. It looks like rulemaking with national interest at the forefront or safety catch-alls, or mandating bargaining regimes that privilege certain suppliers. Now let's look at some of the examples in the Canadian context, such as the Online Streaming Act or Bill C-11, which expanded broadcasting responsibilities into the digital realm, or the Online News Act, which is Bill C-18, which required social media platforms to bargain with news organizations, or the proposals under the Online Harms Act or Bill C-63, which sought to create a digital safety commission with broad control over content. These 3 legal examples demonstrate the expanding administrative power. It increases burdens of compliance and favors institutions and actors that can afford to navigate them. Number 3 is narrative and enforcement asymmetry. Alinsky's advice to make your enemies live up to their own rules becomes a war of law when activists use the courts and institutions to force particular agendas. They file complaints, press for investigations, initiate strategic litigation, in other words, bog down the system. At the same time, prosecutorial discretion and politically salient cases grow this asymmetry. Here's an example under Canadian law. In the Supreme Court 2020 case of Friesen, that decision urged courts to treat sexual violence against children with greater denunciation and deterrence. Now, that's a judicial calibration that paradoxically exists alongside prosecutorial and bail changes that seem to increase in some discretion. And this leads to some surprising sentencing outcomes in some particular cases. In the Friesen case, the courts recognized that violence is always inherent in applying force of a sexual nature to a child. In that case, the defendant Justin Friesen was sentenced to 6 years for a violent and sexual assault against a 4-year-old child. Meanwhile, organizers of the highly controversial 2022 Freedom Convoy were prosecuted and convicted of mischief. and in that case, the Crown sought multi-year terms. It was a visible high-penalty outcome in a public order case, while other violent offenders seemed to walk free. This perceptual symmetry fuels the sense of selective law enforcement. The Crown was seeking 7-year sentences on organizers Leach and Barber, while Friesen got 6 for his violent act. Now, this video is not to condemn or support the truckers. I'm merely pointing out the obvious asymmetry in the application of the law. It would appear that politicians are highly motivated to incarcerate people with heavy punitive penalties for those willing to speak out against their political agenda. This is both an affront to freedom of speech and the freedom of protest. So now let's continue to move from the theory to the tangible evidence. I'm going to provide 3 examples, and each of the example I'm going to provide the following information. I'm going to state the observable fact, then I'm going to cite the primary source, then I'm going to connect the dots to doctrinal mechanism. Then we can consider plausible alternative explanations. Case number 1 is platform governance. The observable facts are: Bill C-11 was designed to modernize the Broadcast Act to include digital platforms. It also required contribution to domestic content and gave the CRTC increasingly broad powers. Several large social media platforms have challenged this regime. Bill C-18 compelled social platforms to bargain with news producers. Meta responded by blocking news links in Canada, and this had an immediate effect on local news sources. What about the connection to mechanism? These are examples of administration expansion and policy-driven information shaping. It's rulemaking that amplifies certain content and turns down others. Let's be honest, if you want to shift the public narrative, then create incentives and constraints for the distribution level. The outcome is narrower channels for certain content and increased reliance on regulatory intermediaries. What about possible alternative explanations? We all know that national cultural policy is a long-standing bureaucratic objective in Canada. And even though we might want to protect our domestic culture against global tech giants, these regulatory responses can seem defensive. Regardless, the effect is this: centralized actors and their policy control discoverability and funding. Let's move to case 2. We're going to talk about law, discretion, and high salience prosecutions. As the Solzhenitsyn quote said earlier, criminals seem to be treated more lightly than people willing to speak out against the public office. As mentioned before in the Friesen case, the Supreme Court agreed to denounce and deter violence against children, especially sexual violence. The defendant, Justin Friesen, got 6 years for his violent acts. And even still, there seems to be even lighter sentencing for similar crimes as of late. In contrast, in a highly political case, leaders of the Freedom Convoy, Leach and Barber, were each being sought after by the Crown a 7-year sentence. So let's connect this to mechanism. One could deduce selective enforcement and prosecutorial discretion, which is being driven perhaps by public pressure. Public order cases that seem to threaten administrative and economic functioning are typically inviting a more visible response. At the same time, the legal architecture, such as statutory discretion and the catch and release program, allows for inconsistencies across a broad area of crime. So let's consider some alternative explanations. Public order offenses that may be interfering with your life or disrupting economic activity may be legitimately prioritized. Conversely, sentencing in sexual offense cases is highly fact-dependent. The perceived contradiction is therefore a product of both legal discretion and political signal value. Case number 3 is cultural institutions and personnel. Here are the observable facts. Universities, foundations, and some NGOs have updated their curricula, changed the criteria for applying for grants, and implemented hiring practices that explicitly prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion, or critical approaches to race, gender, and history. These changes are measurable. New administrative units, hiring calls, and funded research programs. So what's the connection to mechanism here? This is literally the war of position. Change the person in charge of the keys and the narrative becomes the norm. Over time, the policies shift without giving any consideration to foundational law. Common narrative now seems to be that all our forefathers were inherently evil, and we should be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Now, this is failure to the ad hominem fallacy writ large. So let's consider some alternative explanations. Some institutional change is a reaction to real social injustices and demographic change, not just overt orchestration. The same institutional moves that are criticized could be seen as restorative, or it could be seen as capture, depending on the observer's bias and views. Now, I need to pause here and make sure that we have two concepts well buttoned down. Number one is that doctrine does not equal proof of a single unified conspiracy. Gramsci wrote strategy. Alinsky wrote tactics. Cloward and Piven wrote method. Just because these texts are available does not prove an orchestrated and centralized plan to deconstruct classical liberalism and individualism. They may prove convergence of method, but not a singular command. We have to remind ourselves that Manning Johnson's memoir is just that. It's not an internal Communist Party blueprint. To claim cultural Marxism as a single and unsupported label is analytically weak without providing the corollary evidence. We need to remind ourselves that correlation itself does not prove causation. There is not enough evidence to support that there is a conspiracy behind all of this. It's an intellectual shortcut without the understanding of the supporting evidence to that. And while that may be true, it's still happening. We have to draw the evidence of the lineage of Gramsci, the Frankfurt School, Saul, Alinsky, and Cloward Piven to conclude an informed decision on the facts. So what does this synthesis prove and what does it not prove? Here's a couple of strong claims on what it does prove. There exists public, documented strategies and playbooks that seek social transformation by cultural and institutional means. Number two, where these doctrines are adopted in common practice, they predict specified outcomes: staff capture, curricular change, administrative expansion, and selective politically charged enforcement. We see these outcomes in observable policy moves and institutional changes. Number three, the public is perceiving asymmetry under law, and that matters socially and politically. Perceived selective enforcement and cultural disciplining delegitimize institutions and produce predictable backlash. Now, what does it not prove? Number one, it does not prove a single source coordinated worldwide orchestration. While there are hundreds of authors who are making this claim, I'm not making this claim because of the lack of verifiable evidence. What I am claiming is your abilities of observation and the conclusions that you can provide evidence for yourself. Now, that would require documented proof of direction, meeting minutes, funding chains, centralized orders, or admission by a centralized entity. We may have convergence and method here, but I have neither the time nor the collected evidence to demonstrate a single blueprint. In fact, it could be argued here that the facts are undiscoverable and hidden. But to win the convictions of the public beyond opinion, one must demonstrably prove their position. And there are things that we can prove, things that we can disprove, and things that we cannot prove. This also doesn't prove that there is a coordination towards malevolence. While some actors pursue progressivism because of a desire for power, other actors pursue progressivism because they believe they're correcting the mistakes of the past. But even when the motives differ, the outcome remains the same. In order to distinguish between effect and intention, one must take a deeper dive and the thorough observation. I believe, as Ludwig von Mises did, that the bureaucratic apparatus does what it does because they believe in what they're doing, that they can improve things by improving policy, by eliminating all other options other than the one that they've written. But you cannot improve an economy by controlling it more. You cannot improve on freedom by writing policies on it. One must limit the state rather than inflating it. Either way, if you're going to prove this, it's going to take a little bit more than coloring the pages and connecting the dots. So let's propose a conservative libertarian counter-strategy. Here's a response to those who value the ideals of classical liberalism. We have to mandate government reporting on regulatory interventions and their economic outcomes. We have to pull for more narrow administrative discretion. We have to be willing to rewrite or eliminate statutes that refer to the public interest. We need to demand clear legislative standards rather than just mere delegation to the bureaucracy. The next thing is we have to be willing to defend the public square. We have to insist in neutrality and enforcement. We may need to fund alternative community institutions so that the war of position has a rival. We need to demand legal clarity on public protest. We need to advocate for consistent sentencing guidelines and transparent prosecutorial priorities. And hopefully this will reduce the sense of selective enforcement or asymmetry under law. Of course, each of these proposals are contestable. They merely trade one risk for another. I list them as remedies to limit capture and restore parity under law. So in this video, I've tried not to preach or promote any conspiracy theories. In fact, I would reject on principle the idea of conspiracy theories on a purely rationally skeptical basis. But one can chart the intellectual and institutional genealogy that is producing some effects that we are all experiencing. The mechanisms of personnel, rules and incentives. These mechanisms of personnel, rules and incentives have been used, and the Canadian policy history proves concrete examples. This helps move this thesis beyond the theory and into the real world. That Constitution yields an eminently visible account of systematic institutional change, accomplished by pulling the levers of culture, bureaucracy, and legislation. But plausibility is not a knockdown argument for a single mastermind. To be clear, there are dozens of books that support the idea of an evil, nefarious, Lovecraftian evil, a cabal that is driving towards a nefarious agenda. Therefore, the individual that wants to fight against this rising tide of control must do two things. Number one is to care enough to gather the empirical evidence. Funding trails, internal memos, hiring practices, and number two, deploy institutional reforms that drive transparency, create more narrow discretion, and rebuild plurality in civic spaces. If you found this video helpful on your journey of learning economics, financial literacy, history, politics, and philosophy, hit subscribe and stay tuned for more upcoming videos.